there are many things that I think are misstated about the internet. And I think the big one, well, the two big ones I would start with here. The first is that the great forces of history came to bear on the internet, and in some mysterious way, it went from being this wild and woolly place where lots of people were finding community and opportunities for self-expression and new ways to connect, and then became what Tom Eastman calls five giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other four. And that this was some great economic imperative that we could never have avoided. And I think the reality is that we took specific, deliberate policy choices that foreseeably and inevitably led to this. And that we know what those policy choices were, and we know what alternative policy choices we could make. And so we have a kind of plausible path to throw this, what I call enshittification, into reverse, and to make a better internet again. And moreover, the people who made those policy choices are not shrouded in the mists of history either. They're named individuals whose homes we can locate and whose pitchfork sizing is well understood. And so, it's not like we are hopeless here or prisoners of destiny. We have a choice. And the other thing that I would say is that the people who were very excited about the internet early on, including me, were not naive in our failure to understand how technology could go sour. I think that nobody gets involved in an organization like the Open Rights Group or the Electronic Frontier Foundation because you think everything's just going to be fine, right? We had a whole genre of literature, cyberpunk, that was there to say, like, this is how badly it could go. And as I'm constantly at pains to say to tech leaders, cyberpunk was not a suggestion, it was a warning. If there was a thing we were naive about, that we misunderstood, that we failed to grasp, it was that the policies that stopped monopolies from forming had been sort of shot in the guts by Thatcher and Reagan, Mulroney in Canada, and that they were bleeding out. And notwithstanding a few last kind of dead cat bounces, like the antitrust case against Microsoft, which eventually ended in failure because George W. Bush was elected and he dropped the case. The reality it was that we were going to end up in a circumstance where tech companies could buy their competitors, use their access to the capital markets to prevent new competitors from emerging, either by doing predatory pricing or by acquiring nascent competitors, and that they could use the unity that would arrive from reducing the number of tech companies that mattered from 100 to like 5 to come up with a common bargaining position with the world's governments and regulators, and so tilt policy in ways that favored their perpetual, unregulated, unaccountable dominance.
So are you talking about things like Facebook and Google?
Yeah, Facebook, Google. I mean, Google's kind of a great poster child here. We're told that Google is Willy Wonka's idea factory, home of 1,000 amazing inventions. But when you look at Google, they had this one blockbuster invention 25 years ago, full quarter century ago. They made a great search engine. And I don't mean to downplay how great it was. It was magic. It was like sorcery compared to Alta Vista or Ask Jeeves or Yahoo. But they haven't made anything successful since in-house. Video, mobile, ad tech, server management, documents, maps, all of that stuff. They're companies they bought from other people, and where they tried to make their own equivalents like Google Video or their social media networks or any of the other things that they've tried internally, they just crash and burn, right? They are rich Uncle Pennybags, not Willy Wonka. And the same is true of all the other tech giants. I mean, in 2019, just before lockdown, Tim Cook did an appearance with Kara Swisher on stage, and he boasted about Apple having acquired 90 companies in the previous year. Right? Tim Cook's coming home with a new company for his board of directors more often than you're bringing home a bag of groceries for your family. And these companies historically would have been prohibited from making these acquisitions. Today we can barely manage to, or in fact, we failed to stop Microsoft from acquiring Activision, which is an absolutely rotten anti-competitive merger that exists solely for the purpose of reducing choice, squeezing customers and business users, the software developers who make the things that will be sold for their platform. And back then, but before the neoliberal turn, we would have stopped people from doing this. And you asked whether this is a book that is leftist or conservative. I mean, I am leftist, but there is enormous conservative interest in the outsized impact of large firms on the rest of the market. And I think that some conservatives are coming to realize that your choice isn't between an unregulated market and a government regulated market. Your choice is between a government regulated market and a monopoly regulated market. You know, there's a proposal in Canada right now to require the very largest podcasting firms to undergo a very light touch version of the registry that broadcasters and cable operators go through. I don't think it's great, but it's not terrible either. There's been a great panic about it. But the reality is that, you know, we do have a regulator for podcasts, and it's Apple. Because if Apple says your podcast is no longer welcome in its aggregator, your podcast effectively ceases to exist, right? And so, you know, we can either have a democratically accountable regulator who, if they're doing their job, keeps other firms from being so big that they can no longer be held to account, at least not without ballooning the size of government, right? This is the other part of the conservative argument for anti-monopoly activism, is even if you're just, you know, the kind of absolutely deranged person who's got one book on their shelf and it's the Fountainhead and it can no longer be opened because the pages are all stuck together, and the only thing you think the government should ever do is enforce contracts between firms. If the government's not larger than the largest of the firms, then it can't enforce the contracts, which means that if you want small government, you have to have firms that are smaller than the governments that are going to enforce their contracts. And so there is enormous conservative interest in this. And, you know, right now in the US, there's a breakup bill for Google and Facebook going through Congress. And its two co-sponsors are Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz, which for, you know, the Britons who don't follow American politics, and good on you, would be like, you know, Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May co-sponsoring legislation.
Now, what about the idea of competition? This is something that you talk about in the book. American business on the outside states that it's about healthy competition. There's this idea that you know, hey, well, if you want to start a, you know, we just started a social network. It happened to be the best one, and we won. And I mean, you know, anyone else is free as well to start. If you want to start your own social network, that's free. You know, just start it up. That's fine. But in actual fact, you know, the tech overlords absolutely hate competition. I mean, they're trying to wipe out all competition. Peter Thiel, as you mentioned, who was the first investor in Facebook, and is a very powerful Silicon Valley person.
And vampire.
And
vampire is reputed to be infused with the blood of teenagers.
Okay, well,
he invested in a startup that does this in any event.
He's got a kind of Batman-esque quality, that's for sure. And he wrote a book which you quote from. I think it's from that. Competition is for losers, which is almost a witty comment, but I don't think he meant it wittily. He was just saying competition is for losers. And so Facebook, and you know, Facebook has bought obviously Instagram, WhatsApp, countless others. How did that? Another great point you make in the book is that the Googles and the Facebooks portray themselves as this sort of gang of geeks who are sort of beavering away in a basement on big computers, coming up with really amazing computer programs and code. What they don't tell you is that next door to that building of geeks is a building also, which is filled with lawyers
who terrorize anyone who gets too bullshit in competing with them. So, you know, in the days of the before the Berlin Wall fell, the argument that the GDR made for why the Berlin Wall was there was not to keep the people of East Germany in, but rather to keep the people out who would otherwise flock to East Germany to take advantage of its bounty. And Facebook has taken enormous steps to prevent people from leaving Facebook. And they argue that it's not to keep you in, it's to keep the bad guys out. So when Facebook started, they had a single major competitor, which was MySpace. And they went to MySpace users and they said, look, we are a better service in every way than MySpace. For example, you may not know this, but MySpace is owned by a senescent, evil, crapulent Australian billionaire who spies on you with every hour that God sends. And here at Facebook, we will never spy on you, right? That was their promise to the world in 2006 when they opened up to users beyond American college kids. And that was not enough to lure people away from MySpace, because the reason people used MySpace was not who owned it, but who else was there. The people they loved were on MySpace. And going and hanging out on Facebook and admiring the superior user interface and privacy policy while waiting for your friends to have the same realization was very thin reason to go. And so what Facebook did was it gave MySpace users a bot. And if you gave the bot your login and password, it would go to MySpace several times a day, log in as you, grab all the waiting messages for you out of your inbox and pop them in the inbox that you had on Facebook, so you could reply to them there, so that you didn't have to choose between the people you loved and a superior experience or superior respect for your rights. Now, companies have tried to do this to Facebook. Notably, there was a firm called Power Ventures that gave you a single unified inbox for Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and a bunch of other services. And Facebook, nuked them until the rubble glowed. And they now argue that the reason they're so big is because everybody loves being there and no one wants to leave. But they've taken these extraordinary measures to stop people from leaving. And I think that their actions speak louder than their words. And this is likewise true when Amazon says the reason that they control 90% of the audiobook market is that people just like Audible better than everything else. But at the same time, they mandatorily sell every audiobook on Audible with what's called digital rights management that prevents people from deleting their Audible app and converting those files so they'll play on a rival app from a rival store or ecosystem. And again, if they had the confidence of their convictions, right, if they were genuinely the best service, then they wouldn't have to go to these extraordinary measures to stop you from leaving. They could just be the best service and everybody would hang around there.
But they're not. So talk about Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon. We extracted a bit from your book on the IDA website today, where you say that they're all pretty bad, but you particularly hate Facebook.
Yeah.
Although worse than the other ones.
They're all converging, though. I mean, it's funny, since I wrote that, they've really converged. But imagine one of these classic Harvard Business Review 2x2 grids where you've got an axis going this way and an axis going that way. And the axis that goes this way is how surveillant the company is, how much they want to spy on you. And the axis that goes this way is how much of a control freak they are, how much they want to control what you do. And so you have in one quadrant, you have Apple, who don't want to spy on you, but they're going to control everything you do. You can't install software without their permission. Only their technicians can repair your devices. Every connector is proprietary, and so on. And on the other quadrant, you have Google, who don't try to control you at all because they figured out how to spy on you wherever you are. And so anywhere you go on the internet, you're delivering telemetry non-consensually to Google. In the other quadrant, you have free and open source software. I'm speaking to you as do at least dozens of weirdos around the world from a Linux computer. Just
explain that for the non-techies.
Sure. Yeah. Free and open source software is built and maintained as a public good. It's licensed so that anyone can see the underlying code and modify the code and release it. And so this makes it extraordinarily hard to lock people in with free and open source software. And so Linux, which people who are deep in the weeds call GNU Linux for reasons that are far too boring to get into now, Linux is an open source operating system. And just like Mac OS or Windows, you bung it on your laptop and it just works. And the difference is that all the software is free and it's open. And so it can always be modified. I use a tool regularly, 3 or 4 times a week, called Audacity. That's a very popular audio engineering tool. And at a certain point, the people who maintain that tool decided to add some surveillance to it. And it was promptly what's called forked. So the people who objected to the surveillance just copied the source code over and took out the surveillance part and released a surveillance-free version, which is the one that I now use. And so it's just very hard to degrade these programs because you can always alter them, whereas the other ones are really locked in. And the free and open source software just sits in that quadrant where they don't care what you do and they never want to spy on you. And then in the final quadrant is Facebook, who control everything you do and spy on you in every way they can. Now, the thing is, all of these companies have turned into each other. Google has added much more lock-in, much more kind of energy into keeping you stuck on their pages and in their apps and on their operating systems. Apple has now spies on every iOS user with no way to opt out, which is just amazing. They kicked Facebook surveillance out of the App Store. Famously now there's a little tick box if you have an iPhone, and if you tick it, Facebook can't spy on you anymore. 96% of iOS users ticked that box. Presumably the other 4% were like Facebook employees or momentarily confused or drunk, but Apple then immediately initiated a program of secret surveillance on iOS users, doing precisely the same surveillance that Facebook had done, but not telling users about it and using it to do what Facebook did, which is target ads to iOS users. And so Apple has become a company that spies on you and controls you too. And then we've got, TikTok and all the new entrants, Twitter under that weirdo whose name I can never remember's new management. And that they've all become projects that spy on you and control you.
And how did we let that happen? And how can we stop it? I mean, there are people like you who are very sophisticated observers. You can do the Linux computers. I mean, most people haven't got the kind of energy. And I mean, even myself, I've tried to resist it so much. But now I just go, yeah, click, whatever, type in my phone number. And I remember when all this started, I'd be a bit wary about typing in my email address. I would type in a sort of false telephone number. And I don't do this anymore. I sort of can't be bothered. I think, presumably they know that, the people who are designing the systems. There's probably some phrase for it that, where people get fed up with,
surveillance fatigue, nihilism, despair.
Like
Something on those lines for sure.
Like a dog that finally gives in, sort of lies down.
Learned helplessness. Yeah.
So okay, so that's what I want to is moving on to your concept of interoperability.
Yeah, sure.
Which is at the heart of the book. Can you try and explain what that is?
Yeah, just let me briefly correct a negative impression I may have given you, which is that it's hard for normies to use Linux. It's really not. Ubuntu, Ubuntu, it's a Swahili word. It's the easiest one to install. You download it, you put it on a USB drive, stick it in your computer. You could just try it out. You don't even have to install it. And then with a couple of clicks, you can install it on your computer and all your data moves over.
You can do all the same stuff. I mean, you're not cut off from doing Zooms.
Ubuntu was designed to be used in rural sub-Saharan African schoolhouses by people who had no digital nous and no access to tech support. So it's definitely worth a go. In terms of what you can do individually, there are some choices that we can make individually that make things better. Using free and open source software and so on makes a difference. But there are limits to what individuals can do. In an election where you vote with your wallet, you are always voting for the monopoly party. And moreover, the people who have the fattest wallets get the most votes. And so these are not problems that we resolve through individual action. They're problems we resolve through systemic change. And the systemic change I advocate for in the book is to foster interoperability. To understand what that means, first of all, interoperability is the ability to plug one thing into another. So any screw fit light bulb fits in any light bulb socket. Anyone's shoelaces go in your shoes. You can put anyone's petrol in your car. It's interoperable. Some interoperability is inadvertent or not intended. So, you go into a petrol station and there's like a fishbowl full of, 1 pound USB adapters for the cigarette lighter receptacle in your car. The people who made that receptacle, at least until recently, didn't anticipate that, but they also didn't take any steps to stop it. But then there's the much more exciting sort of spicy form of interoperability, which, and this is a mouthful, is adversarial interoperability. This is when you add new features to a product without permission and against the wishes of the people who made it. So think about installing third-party ink in your printer, or what Apple did back in the early 2000s when Microsoft was destroying it by failing to maintain Microsoft Office for the Mac. And so if you were a Mac user making Word files and Excel files and PowerPoint files that you were trying to co-edit or collaborate on with Windows users, who were 95% of the computer users at the time, they couldn't read your files and you couldn't read theirs. Nominally you could, but it just would never work. And so Apple made the iWork suite, Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, which read and writes Excel, PowerPoint, and Word, and they did that against the wishes of Microsoft. They went and they reverse engineered those file formats and made those programs. Again, if you did that to Apple today, they would destroy you, as multiple companies and individuals who tried to make interoperable programs that read and write Mac files have discovered. But at the time, it saved the Mac, right? I was a freelance chief information officer, sort of a glorified IT man back in those days, helping set up and digitize small firms. And, I had many clients where there were a bunch of Windows machines and one Mac that the graphic designer used. And, it was so hard for that graphic designer to collaborate that I would just put a Windows machine on their desk with a copy of Office on it. And then eventually that was so unwieldy that I would just get Adobe products and Quark Express for that computer, bung in a really big graphics card, and throw away the Mac. And this was happening all over the world. People were just getting rid of their Macs because it was too hard to coexist in a Windows world. And it was this adversarial interoperability that saved it. And as tech became more concentrated, it was able to win its regulatory and legislative priorities, because when there's 100 companies, they can't agree on what they want. When there's 5, they sing with one voice in Westminster and Brussels and in DC. And so on the one hand, they got broad latitude to do whatever they wanted with their own products. They were given essentially a waiver on privacy law, labor law, and fair trading laws, so they can do all kinds of bad things to you, but they were also able to get legal restrictions on the kinds of conduct that would have undermined their dominance, right? So they were able to effectively ban reverse engineering. In the United States, the big law was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998. It has its parallel in European law with Article 6 of the Copyright Directive in 2001. And in every country around the world, we've now enacted versions of these laws. And again, without getting into too much detail, they constitute a broad prohibition on that kind of reverse engineering, the same stuff that Facebook did to MySpace, that Apple did to Microsoft. And in order to reverse this, right, in order to make it so that on the one hand, companies know that if they abuse you, you can leave, and so they are less likely to abuse you. And on the other hand, to give you self-help measures in case that's not enough to stop them from abusing you, we need, on the one hand, to prohibit them from abusing your privacy, your consumer rights, and your labor rights, and require them to offer the kinds of interoperable gateways that would allow you, for example, to quit Facebook or Twitter and move to a free and open alternative like Mastodon, but continue to receive the messages that people post for you and follow the people who are interesting to you, be parts of the communities that matter to you, access the customers that you rely on from a different platform managed by different people, maybe just you and some mates who stand up a server, or maybe your local library or council operates it, or maybe it's a nonprofit, or maybe it's a startup, or maybe it's even another large firm that just has different priorities, but they can all talk to each other in the same way that it doesn't matter whose email server you're on, you can send and receive email from everyone else. And on the other hand, we need to restore self-help rights for users. You should be able to reverse engineer your printer and add third-party ink. And if you're not qualified to do that, you should be able to buy someone else's reverse engineering package for your printer that lets you use third-party ink. We should restore those self-help measures. And if we're worried that people who are reverse engineering these products are adding new features to them, that they might not be on the up and up, that they might also abuse your labor, consumer, and privacy rights, well, the restoration and elevation and strengthening of privacy, labor, and consumer rights as against the large firms would also bind these small firms. And so you'd have a remedy against them as well.